All right, it's time to build some routes for our users. And these really aren't specific to users themselves. They're really more around the idea of authentication. So what I'm going to do inside of handlers is make a new file called auth.js. And remember, we said that our handlers are simply functions that we're going to export and put them inside of our routes. So we're just going to be exporting two functions right here. But first, we're going to need our DB, and it's going to be requiring ... models. You might be wondering what file inside of here, and VS Code is really helping me out, models/index. If you leave off the slash here, it's the same thing actually as looking for a /index. It's really nice to name your files index.js. What else are we going to need? We are going to need the JSON Web Token module. So we're going to bring in JSON Web Token. And remember, JSON Web Token is going to be used to create JOTs or JSON Web Tokens. You saw those in a previous screencast. Those are the tools that we're going to be using to mark users as logged in. If there is a token that exists, that's going to be created when the user either signs up successfully or logs in. So we are going to need two functions right here, a function called signin and a function that we'll call signup. You could call this login and signup, whatever you'd like. We'll start with sign in and sign up. And let's actually do sign up first because we don't really have any users that have logged in yet. Now this is going to be a function that is actually going to be, once again, another async function. And these functions accept request, response, and next. Remember, I'm just making a function with parameters. We're actually going to be using them when we call this function. So I could call this request response, but let's go with what you might have seen before with rec and res. It's a little bit shorter, and it's what you'll see a bit more in industry. As with all our async functions, we're going to try catch. And inside of this statement, what do we really want to do here? We first want to create a user. Once we create a user, we then want to create a token. We call this signing a token. Inside of our catch, if something goes wrong, we actually want to see what kind of error. And if it is a certain error, we can respond with username or email already taken. Otherwise, just send back a generic 400, some kind of bad request. So ideally, we'd like to send back a pretty helpful error message so that our client, when making an AJAX request, can display that to the user. But if it's something else that goes on, we're just going to return a bad request error, a status code of 400. So how do we fill in the blanks here? Well, there's actually one more thing we need to do. Before we start creating a token, we need to think back to how these tokens are created. So I'm going to hop over to jwt.io. And if you remember, a JSON Web Token is comprised of three parts: the header, the payload, and the signature. The payload is where we're going to put information that can be decoded, but the signature is what's going to be very important to securely create these tokens. And the signature actually consists of a secret key or some kind of string. This is a string that we're going to store on the server, but that we don't want people to get access to. So in order to create variables that people don't have access to if they were to, for some reason, get access to our server, we need to create what's called an environment variable. And in Node, our environment variables exist on process.env. To create environment variables, we have to load them from some file. And what I'm going to do is make a file at the very root of my folder, and I'll actually do this in the terminal. Let's keep it simple. I'm going to make a file called .env. And inside of here, I'm going to put some kind of secret key. So what I'll do inside of my env file, go back to my text editor, and inside of here, I will simply add a key of secret key and some kind of value. No spaces here are very important. Now, ideally, this would be some kind of random string, so I'm just going to type a bunch of gibberish. It really doesn't matter. Now, how do I take this env variable and load it in my application? Well, there's a module that I need to install, and that is called .env. We're going to use .env to load our environment variables. So you might be wondering, well, where do I actually load those environment variables? Do we do it inside of our auth.js? Well, we actually don't need to, because what we're going to do is inside of our index.js, not over here, the other index.js, we're going to load all of our environment variables. We're going to do that at the very top using require .env.config. And what that's going to do is load all of our environment variables. So where are we actually going to be using these environment variables? Well, we're going to be using it inside of our auth.js. So to create a token, we're going to need some kind of secret key, and we get that on process.env.whatever we named our environment variable. What did we name that environment variable? We called it secret_key, and you'll traditionally see those in capital letters. So that's what I'm going to use to create that token. So now we need to start filling in the blanks. Once we make this route, we can start testing it really quickly, which is nice. So we'll get testing to the terminal very soon, but we have to make this function first. So how do we create a user? Well, we got to use our model. We are going to make a new user, and that is going to be the result of waiting for a promise to resolve. That promise is the creation of that user, and we'll pass in rec.body. This is going to be the data coming in from some AJAX request, or in our case, an HTTP request from the terminal. We then get a bunch of properties on our user. So what I'd like to do is, instead of using user.id and user.username, I'm going to use some destructuring, and I'm going to destructure ID, username, and profile image URL from user. And the reason why I want to do that is because when I make my token, I don't want to have to pass in user.id, user.username, and so on. So I'm going to make a token. And that is the result of the JSON Web Token module and the sign function. And we can see right here, what is the first thing? It is the payload. And the payload itself can be an object. These are the values that will be passed to the token, so when I decode them, I'll see them. I could pass in a key of ID and a value of ID, pass in a key of username and a value of username. And if you've seen the ES 2015 section, you might be saying, hey, wait, you don't have to do that. And you're totally right. If my keys and values are the same, I can simply just do it like this. So I want to pass in the ID, the username, and the profile image URL. This means that if I decrypt the token, I can get access to the ID, username, and profile image. This is going to be very helpful for creating a current user or someone who's logged in. So what's next? Once we sign this object, we need to pass in some kind of secret or private key. And that is going to be process.env.secretKey. That is going to be the secret key that we load from our environment variable. And once we finish that, we can simply return a status of 200, which is everything is okay, and we'll add some JSON response. And inside of here, we will send back the ID, the username, the profile image URL, and the token. We're going to send this information back so that we can see what it is, and it'll be very helpful when we use some JavaScript to collect that data. Now, unfortunately, the way that Mongoose handles errors is not always the nicest. So this is something that you would see from doing this kind of stuff a bit. But there is a specific code when a validation fails, and that is 11,000 as a number. And this is simply if a validation fails. It's a pretty ugly message. So instead of just returning the default message, we're going to say error.message is, sorry, that username or email is taken. So instead of the default Mongoose error message, which is really long and kind of messy and kind of cryptic, we want to make it much easier for our front-end developers or our future self to get back a nice piece of text that we can display. And no matter what, we're always going to return next. And inside of here, we'll pass in a status of 400 and a message of that error.message. We need to do one more thing before we start actually testing this, and that is adding that logic to our routes. So what we're going to do is inside of our routes file, we are going to make an auth.js. And the good news is, since we made a handler earlier, the code here is very minimal. We're going to bring in Express, and that is going to be requiring Express. And then we are going to create a variable called router, which is the result of the Express router. This is simply a nice way to abstract our routes into individual files so we don't have to put everything inside of an index.js. What we're then going to do is bring in a function called signup from require /handlers/auth. Remember, this right here is destructuring as well. If I wanted to, I could bring in the entire module and then attach signup if I want, or I can just destructure the signup function. This is one way of going about bringing in that specific function. So what I'd like to do is say that if there is any kind of post request to /signup, I want to run my signup function. And I'm then going to export out module.exports the router. What's really nice about this is my routes file is very clean. If I want to include other functions right here, no problem. The functions themselves live in the handlers folder, and the routes are all placed right over here. This makes isolating those two quite easy, makes it easier to grow or scale this application. So where am I actually going to be using these user routes? Back in the index.js, where my routes are located, I'm going to be using these auth routes. So we will set a variable called auth routes to be require ./routes/auth. And what am I going to do with these auth routes? I'm going to say, if there is ever any request that starts with /API/auth, go and use these auth routes. So what I've done is I have prefixed all of my routes with /API/auth. Inside of the auth routes, it's going to be /signin. Inside of here, I'm also going to be using the /signup function. So I should have a route now for a post to /API/auth/ whatever I have in my auth routes. And that is coming from routes/auth. That is a signup. So here's where we finally get to test this route. So how could we do that? We could open up Postman. We could try to use curl. And curl is a little bit too much to make sure you get your strings right and pass in all these flags that you have to research. And Postman is a bit tricky as well. There are lots of little things or gotchas here. So I want to introduce you to my favorite tool that is used quite a bit called HTTPy. Make sure that I spelled that correctly, and I'll show you what it looks like. You can use it on Mac or Windows or Linux. It works all over the place. Go see what this looks like. Here's a nice little example of some response that we get back, and here you can see all the installation instructions for all different kinds of systems. What I want to point your attention to is this simple usage right here. All we have to specify is HTTP in the terminal. We can do this anywhere, a post, the route, and then some fields that we need to pass in. So let's try to make a post request to our endpoint, to our API. We'll do that using HTTP post localhost 8081. Do you remember the route? Well, if not, that's okay. Let's look back here inside of our index.js. That was /API/auth. And after that, whatever we have over here, /signup, /API/auth/signup. So let's see what happens when we make this post request. And it says cannot read property create of undefined. Well, why might that be the case? Well, if we take a look inside of our user, we're exporting out that model really well. But inside of our index.js, we're not actually doing much with that model. So you might have seen this mistake before, but what I'm going to do is simply export out a property on whatever I send from index called user. And it's going to be the result of my entire user model. This is essentially the idea of bundling. What you can do here is create lots of properties on module.exports for all of your different models. So you might have been wondering, where was that DB thing that was coming from? Well, I accidentally forgot one step. If we take a look at this DB variable that I was using inside of auth, this essentially is coming from index. But you might have said, well, wait a minute, we didn't export anything from index, and you would have been correct. I just forgot this line right here to export that out. So if we take a look back here, let's go make that post request again. And now it says user validation failed, password path is required, username is required, email is required. Well, that's actually a good thing because I should have to put in a password and a username and an email. But where is this error message coming from? Well, remember, we're sending back this entire thing thanks to our wonderful handler right here, because we are sending back a status of 400 and a message of error.message. But if you think about it, where did this whole nice object format come from? Think back to that error handler we built a little while ago, a key of error and a value of message. Inside of our error handler, we were able to send back a property of message on an object called error. So no matter what kind of error we have, we're always going to send back this specific kind of object. This is going to make dealing with this on the front end quite simple. So you can see here, we need a username, we need an email, and we need a password. So how do we specify that? Well, with HTTPie, it's real easy. We can just simply specify those with an equal sign in the middle. So I'll give this a username of first user, a password of secret, and an email of test@firsttest.com. And what I get back is a successful response. I get back an object with an ID, a token, and a username. Inside of this token, there exists what came in the payload. And we'll see that in a little bit. What I want to do now is pause, take a break. We'll come back and chat about this more in the next screencast because there were a lot of moving parts and I want to go review what we did from the beginning.